Hello, everyone. Oh, and they magically appear on screen as soon as we start talking. Fantastic. Thanks for being here. I know it's late in the Global Partnership on AI Summit in your agendas, but hopefully you still have a little bit of energy to talk about AI regulation and interoperability. For all those folks online who wake up at either 4 in the morning in Europe or midnight or 11 as it is in North America, I love your passion. I think it's great that you're interested in doing this with all of us here. I know that all of us on the panel, both virtually and in person, all care very deeply about this subject and have, I think, pretty interesting points of view. So the objective here is to kind of cover some basics of various regulatory approaches, but mostly to concentrate on interoperability. So in the first place, why we should care about interoperability of various regulatory regimes, what we're seeing, various trends from risk-based approaches and so on, how we're trying to structure interoperability into various regulatory approaches or not, if certain countries are not trying to do that, and where we can go about breeding further interoperability. Obviously, the place we're at right now, the Global Partnership on AI, it's part of its very DNA to generate that, but there's many other places as well, right? The International Standards Organization, the G7, the G20, the OECD Digital Ministerial in a few weeks, the Trade and Technology Council in 1 week, I think, or a week and a half, which are all playing kind of important roles and varying roles. We might want to talk about how each of those are operating. So I'm just going to be moderating here. We're going to try to keep it as informal and light as we can to maintain the energy levels. So I hope you appreciate that. If you have questions, by all means, raise your hand and we'll try to address them. We're going to start off going around the table and giving everybody a chance to first introduce themselves and to talk about the work that they're doing and, more importantly, why they care or believe that we should care about interoperability. After that, we'll go into kind of more precise questions, and we're going to just call people up on the panel, and as others have other points that they want to make. Kevin, Cam, same goes for you. By all means, just interject, and let's try to make it a lively debate. Sounds good with everyone? Great. So without further ado, I'll start immediately to my left with Mohammed Motiwala from the U.S. State Department. Mohammed?
Sure, Mark. Thank you very much. Like Mark said, my name is Mohammed Motiwala. I'm a Foreign Service Officer at the U.S. State Department. I'm part of the new Cyberspace and Digital Policy Bureau, a bureau that was created about 3 or 4 months ago at the State Department to really elevate the importance of cyber and digital policy in our diplomacy and all spectrums of our national security. The question you're prompting is why do we care about interoperability? I am very excited about AI. I'm very optimistic. I think it has a chance to really change so many aspects of our lives, but it doesn't come out without risks. And so the main reason why I think we want to have interoperability is that as different kind of governments and regulatory regimes assess and look at AI, we want to make sure that we don't have a segmented approach that hampers innovation, that hampers economic growth, but it is done in a way that encourages the deployment, design, and development of trustworthy AI that hopefully benefits all of our lives. So,
great. Next up, we have Lisa Vermeer, the lead on the Dutch AI team. Lisa?
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm based in the AI team in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and primarily working on the EU AI Act. So that's why I'm here. And I just want to mention as well that we have several colleagues from other EU governments in the GPAI and in the room, I guess. So especially Slovenia, France, and the Czech Republic did an amazing job in the EU's AI Act. So I feel honored to be here and to talk a bit with you about the EU approach and about the interoperability. So apart from echoing you, Mohammed, because that's straight from my heart, I want to mention specifically that in the Netherlands, the most enterprises are very internationally oriented and transatlantic oriented, very much focused on working and dealing with Canada, with the US, but also around the globe. It's very, Singapore, I mentioned just a few countries. So for our SMEs, for our companies, larger, bigger, it's very, very important that the regulatory regimes are interoperable. And there's actually quite a lot of fear that all these rules and all this talking about risk that will severely hamper their opportunity to work together across the canal with the UK. So this is one of the many questions that we always get at the Ministry of Economic Affairs. So how do we continue exploring our opportunities across the borders, innovate, learn from each other, collaborate? So all these things are very important to have interoperability, discussing risk and safety and fundamental rights, and discussing innovation, new ideas, sharing, and building together on exciting projects. So that's why. Thank you.
Great. Next up, we have Mark Sean, Assistant Deputy Minister, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister at ISED, Innovation, Science and Economic Development Ministry in Canada.
Thanks, Marc-Étienne. Et merci à Samia aussi pour l'organisation de cette panel et Marc-Étienne pour votre facilitation. Thanks, everyone. So I'm Mark Sean. I'm the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister of Strategy and Innovation Policy Sector at the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. That includes a number of kind of core components, many of which kind of are adjacent or touch on this space. So our responsibilities include telecommunications and internet policy, where there's quite a bit of linkage in some ways, although not necessarily direct. We also are responsible for the department's overall innovation agenda, which I think obviously AI needs to fit into that piece. And we steward the policy agenda for the 4 ministers we support. We're also responsible for the department's outward posture on the international stage. So lots of engagement in all of the fora that Marc-Étienne mentioned in terms of the OECD, G7, G20, APEC, GPAI, amongst many others. And then probably most relevant to this conversation is we steward the minister's responsibilities for marketplace framework policy, which is essentially all of the laws of general economic application in the Canadian context from the birth to the death of a corporation. So that includes our incorporation statutes, our competition laws, our intellectual property statutes, our work on privacy and artificial intelligence and data, and then bankruptcy and insolvency. So literally birth to the death of a corporation. So obviously our primary interest in this space has been that we were founding members of GPAI, so on the international side, and then on our continued work in kind of looking at marketplace frameworks. One of our current projects is an update to our privacy laws that includes a specific Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. Why do I care about interoperability? As you can tell from the way I describe my portfolio, I think that's actually my entry point for interoperability, which is there are many aspects of the innovation ecosystem to actually drive for the outcomes that we're seeking, which is the good use of technology, driving towards economic growth and prosperity, and continued ability for Canada to be able to engage in a global market where it can succeed. And that's predicated on the interoperability, not just in AI, but actually the interoperability of all those things I talked about, whether it's all of those international bodies or our marketplace frameworks in general, or the kind of linkage between some of our particular verticals like telecom and some of the ways in which it intersects. And so interoperability for me is really not just in AI, which it is very important, but also interoperability across the overall approaches that we have, because increasingly the digital and data economy is in fact only global for the most part. And so it necessitates a recognition at minimum and ideally a real ability and focus on making sure that things can work together.
Thanks, Mark. Next up, I'll point to Cam Carey at the Brookings Institute. Cam? I think you're on mute still, I think. It's late at night, folks, for people. It's a bit of a challenge. Maybe while we give Cam a couple minutes to... Oh, there you go. We have you now.
Oh, I'm here.
Great.
Yeah, there was a window that was hiding my mute button, so that popped up. But here I am. It's good to be here, Marc-Étienne. Thank you. So I am at the Brookings Institution and co-lead there a project jointly with the Center for European Policy Studies, the Forum for Cooperation on AI, which is very much focused on these issues. And I think the interest in interoperability really comes from fundamentally what Mark Sean said about the nature of the digital economy, the importance of global data flows. As an official at the Department of Commerce before joining Brookings, certainly that's the issues of the digital economy and of data flows were a major focus of my work. But this is particularly true with regard to AI. One of the things we found over the course of the work on our project, which is very much complementary to the work of GPAI, is that in this day and age, all scientific research and development and technology research and development is collaborative across institutions, across disciplines, across borders. And that is even more true of AI. So for the success of the digital economy, for the success of the development of AI around the world, and the development in ways that I think we share as democratic countries, it is important that we do this in a way that is interoperable. That is how we leverage the development, how we leverage the principles and the human-centric nature of AI that we all want. I think that's fundamental to across all of the policies of countries involved, fundamental to the work of GPAI.
Thanks, Cam. Next up, Kevin Allison from Albright Stonebridge, Vice President there. Kevin?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Yes, as Mark Etienne said, I'm a Vice President at Albright Stonebridge Group. We're a private sector consultancy. I specifically, within Albright Stonebridge, help a lot of our clients think about global technology policy issues, including AI and other issues that relate to AI, like semiconductors. And I very much agree with what Cam just said about AI being such a global industry and with the interconnection of the digital economy. I would add just two other points about why we should care about interoperability. To boil it down to a very simple level, I think anyone who's traveled in different countries where you have difficulty making your phone work or difficulty plugging something into the wall can understand why having some basic interoperability in a technology system makes a lot of sense. But I think perhaps even more important than the convenience factor is the fact that as AI, I think over the next decade, increasingly becomes synonymous with just computing, it just becomes a way that computer systems work and do things. If we want people around the world to share in the benefits of AI that I think are now starting to become more, some of the potential is starting to become more apparent with things like protein folding AI algorithms and so on. We need that interoperability because otherwise you get barriers, effectively barriers to trade or barriers to sharing the best technologies in the world as widely as possible across countries. And so if we really are focused on not only avoiding risks, but harnessing benefits of AI, then I think that regulatory interoperability is essential.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So kind of past, caring about interoperability, can we say that we are seeing some trends that are kind of at a lower level altitude than 30,000 feet, right? So everybody says they want rights respecting AI. We're largely seeing risk-based approaches to artificial intelligence, but are we seeing any other degree of convergence between various regulatory approaches? And maybe for that, I'll swing back to Cam and to Kevin, because you have a pretty holistic view of different countries. And Cam, in particular, I know Brookings did a fair bit of work on international cooperation and various regulatory approaches with your paper last year and just a couple weeks ago on R&D. Are we actually seeing this happen, or is these all just nice words?
No, I think there is genuine recognition, I think, Mark Etienne, that of some of the things that I have talked about. This is why I think GPAI exists in the first place. I mean, there was some difficulty getting the United States to join, but it did. And the 2019 executive order that sort of started down the road of AI policy in the United States included requirements for agencies to develop plans for international cooperation, international engagement. We are seeing active discussions in the TTC, in other forums about doing that. There are differences in regulatory approaches. Certainly the executive order in 2019 set out principles of privacy, of human-centered AI, of non-discrimination, but within the context of a non-regulatory approach. And the recent AI Bill of Rights from the Office of Science and Technology Policy takes that further in terms of the details of implementation of what's safe and effective, of how to prevent discrimination, of how to implement transparency in AI systems, but still within a non-regulatory approach. Now, alongside that, we see a fact sheet that outlines specific things that some regulatory agencies are doing in that area. That in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Consumer Finance Protection Board, to more specifically deal with discrimination, algorithmic discrimination issues. But by and large, the U.S. is not going to do comprehensive legislation regarding AI anytime soon, and we'll deal with issues on a sectoral basis. And I think that obviously contrasts with the direction in, for example, the European Union with its AI Act. And I think we have outlined in our report a year ago mechanisms of developing regulatory alignment, also in standards development, also in joint research and development. And I think these are the things that can build the bridges. We have different legal systems, different approaches to law and regulation. I think within the same principles, the same values, and I think so. What we're seeing in, for example, the TTC is to try to take what NIST is doing in the development of its risk management framework and develop a joint risk management approach. That is along the lines of one of our significant recommendations for regulatory alignment. Standards development offer important opportunities to build bridges. International standard organizations are many of the things that I talked about in AI R&D, particularly cross-border. And they offer the opportunity to address the kinds of things, that kind of dislocations that Kevin talked about. And Similarly, I think joint research and development, we talked about doing that with regard to climate change monitoring and management, as well as privacy enhancing technologies, both because those are important problems where AI can be helpful to the solution, but those also offer the opportunity to work together on the ground in ways that can overcome some of the sort of broader conceptual legal differences in approach, and understand, I think, the similarities in the way that we want to see AI implemented.
Thanks, Cam. Kevin, did you want to say a few words there?
Yeah, just to follow on that, I think there's a few different ways that countries can try to align on things. And as you said, Mark Etienne, there already is pretty broad alignment on what should trustworthy AI systems do in a very general sense. Like, yeah, I think you said the 30,000-foot view. There's general alignment about that. So that's good. You can align on principles and the philosophy of what makes AI trustworthy. And so we've got that. You can align on regulatory approaches, so the specific paths or strategies that countries take to actually, what kind of requirements they put in place. I think that that's a little less likely, as Cam said. The US and the European Union, just to look at transatlantic cooperation, they're going to pursue that alignment on principles through very different means. And I think that's just a political inevitability. That's probably okay. I guess another place you can align is on tools. So you can look at the toolkit that you're taking to the problem of establishing whether an AI system is trustworthy. And you could say, well, even if we don't align on the specific approach because of our different political systems or political realities, perhaps we can align on not only standards, but tools for measuring things, tools for assessing trustworthy AI. And I think that one of the things I'll be looking at for the upcoming US-EU TTC conference is whether one of the deliverables on the AI track within that has to do something around tools and measurement and kind of a common toolkit. So I think we're seeing some promising signs. I ultimately think that on the details of the regulatory approach, there's going to have to be some kind of agreement that maybe the alignment is in the fact that you have a group of like-minded countries with democratic checks and balances and democratic backstops around their institutions. That means you should feel comfortable that country A and country B may be going about it in different ways, but with a common set of standards and toolkits for measuring things. And they're trying to focus on achieving the same sort of output, which is in the end, like that the AI systems that are coming out of these regulatory approaches are trustworthy in themselves. And that will ultimately, the proof will be in the pudding.
Thanks, Kevin. And I guess for the other panelists here, I mean, is it utopian to think that a few years down the road, once we have the EU AI Act in place and we have regulatory regimes in other jurisdictions, that kind of whatever conformity assessment process there is on high risk or high impact, as Canada defines it, Canada always has a slightly different, it's the same thing with the Canadian Football League versus like the NFL, just add a player to say it's Canadian. We call it high impact as opposed to high risk. But whatever the version that is that we take, right, is it utopian to think that a conformity assessment that a company would undergo in Canada would be recognized as equivalent in the EU and vice versa, or for Singapore or other like-minded countries that are generally aligning? And are we seeing the seeds of that, or do we have the necessary bed to generate that in the regulatory approaches that we're seeing take place thus far? I don't know if anybody wants to take that in particular, Mark or Lisa or Mohammed.
I'm happy to start, and then yeah, I mean, I think, well, it's useful. The bane of having a number of marketplace frameworks means that I always come at things with a ability to toggle between them to see how we've done it in other ways. So if that's the question, I think if we look to other kind of frameworks, I'd say the jury's still out whether or not we'll get to clear alignment, because obviously on privacy we're still in a world where the EU and Canada and a number of other countries have mechanisms to be able to recognize one another as adequate or as mutually kind of reaching the same goals for allowing for data flows, and it's telling that it's obviously a major deliverable of the TTC to try and ensure that there actually is going to be a mechanism on the US side. So and we're still not in a world where we've got generalized agreement, at least in that space. Maybe a little more promising on intellectual property, which is much, much older, where we still have domestically driven intellectual property laws that are still adjudicated at national levels, but lots of mechanisms to be able to allow for kind of international alignment and interoperability. So now it took treaties. It took a really long time to get to treaties that allow for that. So I'm hopeful. Certainly, we're building our system in Canada with the recognition that we would like entities to be able to be transportable and to ensure that we're not adding undue burden to allow them to be able to have to do the same kind of conformity again. And so, I think there's always this tension between kind of special snowflake kind of desires for domestic kind of specificity while being interoperable. And I think, if I look at where we're at with the EU on privacy, I think we've found a decent space in which we can have a privacy law that's not special snowflake on purpose, but does recognize our Canadianness in some ways and still allow it to be interoperable with our EU colleagues. That's our aim on AI, but I think lots of the plumbing is kind of being built out now, and it's promising in standards. It's promising in a number of these kind of potential compliance mechanisms, but I'm not sure we're yet. As I say, if you look across, I'm not sure we're going to have consistency in a way that I would say it's going to be obvious that everyone's going to align in one particular way.
Thank you. Well, I think you formulated quite a good end goal to have alignment of conformity assessment. That would be wonderful to have that, but I think we will be going through a lot of years where that is still a nice goal on a longer term horizon. So we also have to be honest that there will be the necessity for lots of entities and especially companies to get understanding not only the regulatory regime in the place where their headquarters are, but also the places where they want to exchange or where they want to sell their products, to be very concrete. So to turn to the role of the governments there is that we can play a role in facilitating that understanding, but that also necessitates an understanding on our side. So for example, our exchange about our regulatory regimes, which is already quite challenging, but GPAI may be an excellent forum to actually do that together in the upcoming years. And to look at the AI Act a little bit, if you talk about conformity assessments, and a conformity assessment in the AI Act means conformity with all the 10 requirements for high-risk AI systems, which implies understanding of which are the high-risk areas, which are the high-risk products, and then understanding of all the 10 different requirements, which are on data quality, data governance, risk assessment, risk management system. It's a lot. Cybersecurity, robustness, what have you. So maybe of course, there's a very important article in the AI Act is about standards, about harmonized standards, and there's also this matter of EU common specifications, but maybe that's more for a technical panel. But the harmonized standards are going to be very, very important to build them in a way that we in the EU will not only focus on the EU standardization organizations, but really prioritize the international collaboration as a first step. And what I would like to end with is that something that may also really help to achieve that end goal of aligned conformity assessments in the end is to ensure the engagement of lots of different stakeholders in the international standardization processes, because that will make sure that those standards are already so broad accepted by many international actors that it will be easier to achieve alignment of the conformity in the end.
Great. I see Cam has a hand raised, but just before, maybe point to Mohammed really, really quickly, but just on the point that you were making, isn't standards going to likely be that most fertile ground for cooperation? So even though you're not perfectly aligned, those standards that are harmonized to map to those 10 requirements, say you have one on robustness or on a risk management framework in place. If you harmonize, ISO 42001, and I'm not going to go too deep here because we had another panel on standards before, and there were far fewer people than there are here, which is very telling about how interested people are. But if that gets harmonized and recognized, and then it gets, largely it gets the equivalent of harmonized or recognized by Canadian regulations, and then the NIST AI risk management framework gets incorporated into 42001 or another ISO equivalent framework. I mean, really de facto, if you know that you're complying as a company or a startup or whatever it is, with that check mark, you have the same check marks. You might have to go through a different conformity assessment process, but there's alignment there. And that's part of the goals of the TTC, right? There's a specific working group on that, and the US is driving towards that. Mohammed?
Yes, kind of echoing what you said and what Cam and Kevin said. I don't know where we're going to be 5 years from now, but we are making, I think, progress towards having some kind of interoperability. Like mentioned, the United States and the European Union plan to release an AI roadmap that emphasizes both security and risk management when dealing with AI at the next ministerial coming in early December. This roadmap will hopefully kind of ensure that the new technologies that are developed, are in line with our shared democratic principles and our free market principles. Insofar as other areas where we're doing kind of AI policy discussions and trying to have some kind of convergence or interoperability is at the OECD. We are strong supporters of the work being done at the OECD on digital economy issues. We were supportive of the working group on AI governance, and I think what Mark mentioned earlier on promoting data-free flow, which is a critical element when we're developing AI systems. We, the CDEP, just approved a declaration on trusted government access to private sector data private data held by the private sector. And that's the first time we've actually articulating what democratic countries do when accessing data held by the private sector for national security and law enforcement purposes. And I think just like a step to encourage and promote the data-free flow of trust.
Cam, you had your hand raised?
Yeah, thank you. Your question about conformity assessment, Mark Etienne, really brings us into standards. And yeah, it's technical, it's geeky, but it is the guts of what makes technology operate. And I think in a digital world, standards are going to become increasingly important as part of international governance. And I think one of the challenges we have is, how do we sort of preserve the research-based technical competence of standards while elevating them in that way without politicizing them, without making them top down. And I think one of the issues with the AI Act is when talks about harmonized standards, that means harmonized within the EU, and with specifications set by the Commission. Now, it's my understanding that the Parliament wants to go in the direction of prioritizing international standards and really looking to ISO instead. I think that for international interoperability is the better way to go. And I think with that, then I think there's the opportunity to really have joint conformity assessments, common conformity assessment mechanisms. But if it's going to be, as Mark called it, it's a special snowflake approach, that makes it potentially problematic.
Yep, there's a question here in the audience.
Thank you. I think I have a follow-up question to what was just said. My name is Clara Neppel. I'm from IEEE. How do you see this necessity to have an international standardization and collaboration when we have in the well, everywhere now push towards digital sovereignty? And especially the European standardization strategy explicitly says that only European stakeholders that can take part in European standardization. Well, there is a way to collaborate through the ISO, but I would say there are other standards organizations like IEEE that already have standards there, and taking into account that it takes a long time to develop these standards, sometimes 3-4 years, I think it would be good for everyone to look into other standards organizations as well, and to open it up also for others to collaborate. How would you suggest this can be solved?
I could take a quick stab at it as a moderator, and then let others chip in. Just for my name is Mehket we met for everyone. Hi, I'm the global lead for AI policy at Amazon Web Services, AWS, and the standards AI/ML standards team reports into our team, so we're pretty familiar with the process. That is a concerning development, I would say, from our perspective. I will say, though, that that process, from my understanding, doesn't prevent them from choosing to harmonize standards that are international standards in the first place, right? So that they have the ability to pick ISO 42001 as essentially the Senelec standard, which then becomes the EU standard. Everybody still here interested? Great. And I'm like, it's Kafka-esque, this world. So I'm still hoping, and I believe that in most circumstances, that is likely what will be the outcome. And I think the reason why that is for anybody here who has spent time in standards working groups, it is, as you said, an extremely long, extremely boring process that, it's not, while there are some technical barriers to participation, which certainly I could say from AWS, we've advocated in pretty much every working group that they should be made public where possible to be able to lower various barriers to entry. I'd say the biggest barrier to entry is the time commitment and the ability to dedicate yourself to that. And you need real professionals who are experts in the subfield that you're talking about. So if you're talking about robustness, it's not me, the lawyer, who's the right person to be there to talk about robustness in that context. Often, too, a technical person is a little bit lost in the process of how this functions over time. So it's a very precise kind of skill set that you need to be able to develop that. And I think the idea that, well, we can just bring all this in-house and make it kind of a bureaucratic process belies a potentially lack of understanding of how complex it is to develop kind of industry-based or standards that are going to control essentially industry processes if they're going to have any traction. I don't know if there's others who have views on that.
Yeah, just weigh in really quickly, and then so I'd say I'm optimistic in the same way about potentially equality of outcome without necessarily equality of process in the same way. I think we also need to be eyes wide open, though, that standards are not neutral, and the standard making world is not neutral. I think there is an extraordinary effort being placed into standard setting geopolitically and globally that is not about, to reduce it down to other standards like whether or not it's A4 or legal. That the question of A4 versus legal is in some ways a banal example about a highly politicized kind of function in many ways. So I think we need to be, on the one hand, eyes wide open and wary, because not all standards are created equal. Not all standard setting organizations are created equal. But I think ideally we get to a place in which we can actually have equality of outcome, at least between kind of like-mindeds that are going to be willing to adopt a process that's actually going to incorporate by reference a standard that gets us to the same place. I'd say, again, to kind of come back to parallels between other systems, that's roughly where we've gotten to in a couple of these other places. I talked about the intellectual property system earlier, but even on privacy, if you're a small and medium-sized enterprise in Canada right now and you want to do global business, you can rely on a few things. You could comply with PIPEDA, our Personal Information and Protection of Electronic Documents Act, our domestic private sector privacy law. You could decide that, you know, your major customers are actually in Europe, so you're going to use GDPR yourself as opposed to relying on adequacy from PIPEDA. Or maybe you're actually really interested in kind of the US and kind of Asian markets, and so you're going to sign up and spend all of the money to do cross-border privacy rules under APEC. All of those get you to the same outcome of saying, check mark, like you're privacy compliant and you're doing the right thing. So ideally we create those mechanisms. Ideally we don't create 1,000 of them. But I also think we have to recognize that, that this is not a neutral territory necessarily, and that there are some pretty important questions about who we entrust around some of those and then who we incorporate. And then I'll say more just to say that, that digital sovereignty then actually goes way further in some regards about other things that we probably need to factor in.
Thank you. Let's indeed not create thousands of these mechanisms. That would be quite a lot. From the European perspective, there are two challenges with regard to this question. And I'm speaking more on behalf of myself, being someone who dedicated quite some time of thinking about the AI regulation in Europe, and not particularly on behalf of the Netherlands or the EU. With regards to IEEE, I know that standardization organizations from internet standards. And I think it's very valuable to think of a way how IEEE can connect on a more institutional level with the ESOs, the European standardization organizations, at least. So that is, I think, an avenue that should be explored anyways, and probably has been, but I'm not that knowledgeable also on that area. And the second challenge is a bit more into the EU nitty-gritty way of things, and that is that the European Commission is pushing forward the approach of common specifications. It's already pretty old. There's in a lot of acts, in a lot of regulations, there's harmonized standard, but also common specifications. And they can be, in the AI Act is formulated that if the harmonized standards are not on time or insufficient, then the EU can come forward, the European Commission can come forward with common specifications as a replacement of the harmonized standard. And I think that risks to become a gliding scale, because if you say it's insufficient according to the objectives of the harmonized standards, in one of the versions of the AI Act that has been circulated and leaked through Politico was digital sovereignty, one of the objectives of the harmonized standards. And that basically alarmed us and said, well, how are you going to assess that? So this is a very, it's a challenging area. And our position also in the Netherlands with regards to the standardization strategy is to be reluctant with common specifications and to be very much focused and prioritize harmonized standards whenever possible.
I think the common specs is a pretty solid Damocletian sword to make sure people get their job done in the standards world. I saw we'll get to, I saw Kevin had a hand raised. Kevin, did you want to say a few words here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the tension here gets to a really interesting issue about AI, because when part of it is when you talk about standards, people can mean different things. The standard for what makes a certain thing, combination of technologies, be that technology, like a very dry, very technical standard for defining technologies, is different than the standards that we're talking about, which are standards around trustworthy AI, ethical AI, or dealing with risk or bias, that really cuts to the heart of the issue of why AI is such a tough regulatory problem, because it is bound up in things like privacy and ethics and concerns about how this technology is going to be applied to affect real people in the real world in ways that are very meaningful to them. And so I think in a way we kind of need to distinguish between these very much more dry technical standards. I mean, setting standards for trustworthy AI can also be very dry and technical, don't get me wrong. But it's not the same thing as saying this is 5G, right? It's a different sort of challenge. I agree that the sort of digital sovereignty angle on the EU standardization strategy is slightly concerning, particularly if the EU harmonized standards end up diverging meaningfully from standards set by some of the global standards organizations. So while I understand the motivations for the EU and wanting to put forward that strategy, for example, broadening the different number of stakeholders at the table, I do think that there would be a danger in any standards that diverge too much from the global ones. It might just mean that Europe ends up more on the sidelines of the AI revolution, because of it would create this interoperability problem potentially.
Mohammed, did you want to say a few things here?
I just wanted to say, I mean, I know I'm not an standards expert, but kind of echoing what Mark said, these aren't necessarily neutral. They do have a geopolitical context now, and it's one of the reasons why we continue to support a industry-driven kind of multi-stakeholder approach when developing standards, kind of a bottom-up approach. Insofar as the broader standards of kind of not technical, but when we're talking about AI systems, I think what's the basis is kind of our shared democratic values. Right, that's kind of what distinguishes us between authoritarian regimes. This is kind of why we have GPAI and we have certain memberships here. This is just not based on your development of your AI industry and your technical capabilities, but it's also kind of based on values. And this is why one of the reasons why we're such a huge supporter of the recommendation on AI from the OECD. It puts the human at the center of everything.
I'll say too, and Joanna, you'll be right next with your question, but to me, part of the question, if the objective is to just broaden stakeholders, there's numerous ways of doing that other than the one that's been proposed. I think one very basic one, in my previous life, I worked in a startup where we tried to dedicate staff and resources to support the Canadian government in its standardization approach. You have to take engineers away from doing work, and you don't have a whole lot of those, right? You have to dedicate time. You have to show up at board meetings and defend why you're spending time on a thing that will probably mature potentially in 5 to 6 years and may have been the exact same whether you had participated or not, and you don't get a tax credit for doing it. So a very basic thing would be, it'd be great if you had an R&D tax credit if you participated in standards work. I mean, just some of these things would help people actually participate. Joanna, I see you have a question.
Okay, I'm sorry. Oops, is it on? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to be the evil and do the comments and then the question, just because I was invited as a speaker to a recent meeting about trying to do the EU standard, the standards for the EU AI Act. And I was sort of surprised that they are, part of the reason they're doing it entirely in-house with European standards meetings is to make sure we all talk about the nice part of standards, you know, like, oh gosh, we can, you know, plug in our phones or whatever. But it's also a form of regulatory capture. It's also being seen as a way to try to interfere with the EU's capacity to regulate and protect its own citizens. And so one of the things that they're doing is working to massively accelerate the standards process and get it done. They're actually starting it in parallel to writing the act, you know, and so they are really trying to make sure that nobody is sidelining them. And so I think this comes back to my actual question, which is why I sort of thought it was okay to say that. I felt like a lot of my fellow Americans, although I'm also British and I'm here representing Germany, I was ambiguous about whether you were talking about interoperability in the standard AI, like we're going to be sharing data in a similar understandable format, or whether you're really talking about regulatory interoperability. Because I don't see why, you know, just as a technologist, I don't see why it should be a problem as you go from one country to the next. Of course, they won't have the same standards. We're trying to make it interoperable, not identical, so that you would say, okay, we know that, you know, this country's stuff is a subset of that country's. You always have to add on this one piece if you do this, you know. The AI Act isn't really that big of a deal. Yes, there's these 10 steps, but it's really not that much more than ordinary product law, except for, you know, taking into account with you know, where you have to be careful, and when you're being careful, what you have to record when you're being careful. You know, other than that, it's just it's a more detailed explanation of due diligence when a machine is the one that's taking an action. So I don't
know if there's others who want to tackle this, or I can say a few words. All right. Well, I think the way that we've been framing interoperability, though it's open for discussion by all means, is about if you are within a certain risk category, say in the EU, and you meet all the requirements that you're saying, you know, they're not so intense, but you do have to meet these requirements. For a very small startup, it may be a pretty difficult process the first time you go about doing it, certainly to understand what those standards mean for you. If then that company exports its product to Canada or to Singapore, or if it's product is a component of another product that's then sold in Canada or in Singapore. And that risk category is also identified as being high risk or high impact or whatever Singapore will call it in that jurisdiction. Do you have to start over from scratch? And does that mean a $200,000 engagement with PwC or Deloitte or KPMG or whoever else is going to come and do this audit process for you? Or can you have confidence that you've gone through it? You may have to do some tweaks, right? Some add-ons or whatever it is, but largely the underpinnings are the same, right? I think that's the goal of interoperability. I don't know if you disagree or have different views here.
No, I certainly agree and can say a little bit more on the AI Act approach, but also to say that I like the way you frame the AI Act, because it's often not perceived like that, but just a way. It's not that bad, and it's just a bit more complicated product requirements. That's a wonderful way of putting it. I hope that it will work that way, and it will be pretty easy to adopt to all these requirements. But we have to be honest as well. If you look at the GPAI countries, all countries are developing regulatory frameworks. Some are more stringent than others. I think the AI Act does a good job in being, well, very, very far-fetching in terms of what is required from companies in high-risk categories, at least. So we have to be honest that the global AI market is not in a few years from now. It's completely different than a few years back. And of course, the mechanisms that are used to regulate this market are not new, but it's an adaptation process that will be challenging for companies and for entities in the future. In any case, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Mark, I would just add in. So there's an interesting question about where the burden of interoperability lies. Because I think one of the things that we're actually potentially not being fully kind of upfront about is that there is a burden of interoperability, and it's a question of who you put it on. So to Mark Etienne's kind of framing, which I think is a useful one, ideally the state is not putting it back onto the small and medium-sized enterprise to essentially kind of redo the process in some ways. But that burden then flows up to the state, which, and this is where sovereignty questions become quite important. So, and this isn't the only public policy, this isn't the first time in a public policy consideration that we've had to face these types of challenges. So, not because we're not friends and not because we're not the closest of trading partners, but, Canada and the US have a ton of consistency between our Food and Drug Administrations in terms of their oversight and regulation of approvals for health products. We have not, and except in extraordinary circumstances, including in the pandemic, ever said we just holus bolus accept the authority and approval of our companion regulator in another country to be able to just say, well, that the US said that drug's fine, totally fine, just ship it into Canada, all good. We very much still, and we have placed some of the burden of interoperability on the applicant. So there's a Canada section. We actually have a joint website. We have an intake system between our two regimes where you put in your drug. You can actually put it into both regulators at exactly the same time. There's a little Canada package at the back end that says can you meet these particular additional circumstances to ensure that you're meeting our requirements? And then we both go. So I think to the question about what interoperability means. So ideally, as we are constructing these regulatory regimes, we are not only constructing them towards our own domestic objectives and ensuring that we're actually going to be able, but we're actually then also constructing the infrastructure and architecture for that interoperability. But I think we need to be very mindful that the burden has to live somewhere. Either there's an entrusted group within the state that potentially, there's standards as well that can work within that organization. But even then, if you're putting into regulation, someone actually needs to make the determination of which standard you're incorporating by reference. So I would just say, I think someone's going to have to do the hard work of trying to make those assessments. We can make it easier in a number of cases, but I'd say there still is someone is going to have to continue to kind of play out how we make equivalencies.
I think the point is that it's not black and white, right? This is going to be either fairly interoperable or not very interoperable at all.
Can I make one addition?
Yeah, but we very quickly, because
Very
we have to
quickly,
go to
yeah.
the last little closing bits after this.
One addition is about the use of definitions and words. I don't want to talk about the definition of AI system. Please don't do that. But you mentioned, Mark-Etienne, about the word of impact.
Yeah.
So we're using the word risk. And I think in the TTC, we're moving towards having discussions on what we mean by all these words.
Yeah.
And I think that is something very, very important.
Well, that's a
to reach.
fantastic segue to the final question.
You're welcome.
Which we'll try to go through quickly. And I said I'll get, everyone can say maybe 30 seconds as their quick answer. But, you know, the TTC is meeting, I think, on the 5th of December. There's always a declaration that follows these meetings. It has already leaked. You can find it and read it if you want to see what it is that they're thinking of saying. But like, as you mentioned, looking at risk categorization, interoperable definitions of risk and harm, and of characteristics like bias and robustness and so on. There's a fair bit of substantive content in there at the TTC. So if we're talking about breeding interoperability, is the TTC now kind of the place where this mostly happens? Is there a role for GPAI? And if it is the TTC, what about every country that is not in the European Union and in the United States, or the United States? Anybody want to quickly take a stab at that?
I think absolutely there's a role for GPAI, not surprisingly. I will note, our minister has had very good conversations with both his counterparts on the side of the TTC, and I think feels engaged in that process, notwithstanding the fact that we're not there. But I'd say absolutely we will need to continue and have, in fact, in other zones, created mechanisms for interoperability that live beyond just what the EU and the US are able to articulate. Will it be norm setting, and will it be, path breaking in many ways? Absolutely. But, again, to keep coming back to privacy, there's been many breakthrough kind of pathways for the US and the EU. It hasn't stopped the fact that the EU has adequacy regimes with lots of other countries that it doesn't have with the US, like Canada.
Cam, Carrie, do you guys want to chip in here?
Well, I think the discussion that we're having is an example of, I think, the sort of multi-faceted, multi-channel sort of policy development that we need to have in a connected world, in a networked world. And similarly to networks, I think these ideas need to propagate through various pathways, and with diversity, with diversity in the sense of duplication and a lot of different pathways. So ETC is one, but I think we began, I think, as in our Forum for Cooperation on AI as what was initially a transatlantic discussion, or really a US-EU discussion, became quickly a transatlantic discussion, and then expanded to include Japan, Singapore, and Australia. And I think you see that through many different kinds of efforts, and changing international forums. And I think that's the way we have to continue to develop these policies.
Thanks, Cam. Kevin?
And I would just chime in to say there's one very big group of countries we've barely talked about at all today. Well, one is China, which we can maybe set to one side for the time being. But then you have emerging markets or global south countries who are not as involved with any of these transatlantic discussions on AI policy. They're not involved in G7. And I think that, it gets to this other issue, which is there's another way of creating standards, a tried and true way of creating standards, which is to create facts on the ground. And that is what China has been doing in a lot of emerging markets for many years now, with funding build-outs of IT infrastructure, rolling fiber, building data centers. And I think eventually, China's not going to stop AI innovation either. They're going to start deploying applications and systems that have China's own unique approach to some of these questions. And so I think that when we're talking about the whole world in AI interoperability, for the US, other European partners, and other G7 partners, that's a still unanswered question, is in the context of AI governance, how to kind of get buy-in if there's a vision of like-minded democratic values, how to get buy-in from these many other growing economies around the world, many of whom are likely to prioritize access to services, frankly, over more geopolitical questions, including whether they align with the sort of Western democratic like-minded community on AI governance. So I think that's a really thorny and knotty challenge that none of this has addressed yet.
That's a great point, Kevin. I mean, we kind of assumed the duality of two interoperable regimes at the start of this conversation, but we didn't lay that out. Mohammed, last word?
Yeah, just quickly say that, you know, the TTC is an important venue for AI discussions, but it's not going to be the only one. I don't know if we actually see GPAI as that forum. We look at it more as a place to do kind of practical projects on AI, but kind of what I mentioned earlier, the OECD, I mean, we are a big fan. You know, we have Andy Wyckoff here, we have a great team, Secretariat, and it does have a much broader community of members that just don't include Europe and the United States and North America. And it is engaging kind of the emerging economies, and it's a forum where we are very optimistic on being able to have these complicated but important discussions on AI.
Thanks, Mohammed. Well, we're at time. In fact, 1 minute past. I'm going to thank everyone for attending, and obviously all the panelists, both in person and virtual. And by all means, come up and have a chat with us if you want to talk more. Bye, everyone.
No, we have to go to steering committee meetings. So.
Fun to hear.